At 7:41 in the morning on August 7th, 1942, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh pressed himself deeper into the seat of his Grumman F-4F Wildcat, somewhere over the waters north of Guadalcanal, and watched the Mitsubishi A6M Zero do something that should have been physically impossible. The Zero flew straight through the cone of his machine gun fire. Walsh saw a strike spark along the wing route, at least what looked like solid hits, and then the Japanese fighter snapped into a turn so tight and so fast that it vanished behind his left shoulder before his brain could catch up with his eyes. By the time he hauled his nose around to where the Zero had been, the sky in front of him was empty, and the Zero was now somewhere behind him, which, in a fighter engagement, is the only place in the world that truly matters. This was not the story of a pilot freezing, panicking, or making a rookie mistake. Walsh was skilled. He was trained. He had done exactly what the manual prescribed. He had placed his gun sight on target and squeezed the trigger at the proper range. And the Zero had simply flown through his bullets and lived. Not because Walsh failed, but because the geometry of his own weapons betrayed him at the exact moment he needed them most. This was happening all across the Pacific in the summer of 1942. American after-action reports from the early battles over Guadalcanal began repeating the same uncomfortable theme. Pilots were getting firing solutions. They were seeing hits, and yet the enemy kept flying. The problem had a name: Convergence. To understand it, you have to understand how wing-mounted guns work on a fighter aircraft. The guns are not pointed straight ahead. They are angled inward, like two people standing on opposite sides of a room aiming at the same spot on the floor. The streams of bullets cross at a specific distance in front of the aircraft, usually somewhere between 250 and 300 yards. At that exact point, both streams arrive at the same place at the same time. The concentration of lead is devastating, enough to shred almost anything in the sky. But the critical word in that explanation is distance. Outside that convergence point, the bullet streams are still spreading toward each other, like water from a hose being waved rather than aimed. Inside that point, the streams have already crossed and are diverging again, which means a wing gun fighter has one narrow window of perfect lethality. If the target isn't exactly at that distance when the trigger is pulled, the pilot is essentially spraying the sky and hoping. The Zero pilots understood this with ruthless clarity. The Mitsubishi Zero had been engineered from its first rivet to be the most maneuverable carrier-based fighter in the world. Its pilots had spent years in combat over China and across the Pacific, learning to read the geometry of an engagement the way a chess master reads 3 moves ahead. And what they saw in 1942 was simple. American wing gun fighters were deadly at one precise distance and far less dangerous everywhere else. All they had to do was refuse to be at that distance. Through sheer agility, a Zero pilot could slice through the narrow convergence window, survive the burst, and continue the turn. And once he completed it, he would often reappear from a direction the American pilot hadn't anticipated, now holding the advantage. The kill numbers spoke for themselves. In the opening months of the Guadalcanal campaign, American pilots flying the Wildcat were tasked with stopping a Japanese air arm that had superior range, extraordinary maneuverability, and veterans who had been fighting for years. Even when an American achieved a firing position, the lethal window was so narrow and so brief that a skilled Zero pilot could slip through it and live. Meanwhile, the cost, in burning Wildcats and dead aviators, was rising toward figures the Navy's leadership struggled to explain to families back home. Into this specific and bloody problem came an aircraft that had already sparked years of heated argument within the engineering community. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine, twin-boom interceptor that looked like nothing else in the sky. Strange, unconventional, almost futuristic. And it was built around an idea so simple it bordered on offensive. Put all the guns in the nose, mount them together, align straight ahead, and eliminate convergence entirely. Because a bullet fired from the nose of an aircraft travels exactly where the nose is pointed, from muzzle to horizon, at every distance. Not just at one carefully calculated magic number 250 yards out. The Lightning's nose carried a weapon package that made those who understood it fall silent. One 20mm Hispano cannon with 60 rounds. For .50 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds each. All 5 weapons clustered tightly in the nose, between the rudder pedals. All 5 firing straight ahead. All 5 hitting wherever the pilot pointed the aircraft. The weight of fire that package could deliver in a 1-second burst had no real equivalent among wing gun fighters of time. Pilots who first wrapped their hands around the Lightning's throttles and squeezed that unified trigger began to realize something profound. This was not a compromised aircraft designed by committee. It was a buzzsaw. The only remaining question was whether anyone in authority would recognize that before the Zero pilots finished their work over Guadalcanal, the men with clipboards and performance charts had their objections. The P-38 was too large, too complex, too expensive to maintain in primitive island conditions. 2 engines meant twice the chance of mechanical failure over open ocean. Its cockpit heating was inadequate at altitude. Its counter-rotating propellers created handling quirks that took time to master. And perhaps most damning in the eyes of tacticians, it could not outturn a Zero in a low-speed turning fight, which many decided was the only kind of fight that mattered in the Pacific. Every one of those criticisms was technically correct, but they were solving the wrong problem. And every one of those criticisms missed a point by a distance roughly equal to the gap between a convergence cone and a buzzsaw. The pilots who were about to take the Lockheed P-38 Lightning into combat over the Pacific would spend the next 3 years making that gap impossible to ignore. The first Lightnings arrived in the Pacific in late 1942, painted in dull olive drab and carrying a reputation that had traveled ahead of them like a bad rumor. The men who had formed opinions about the aircraft had done so from behind desks, thousands of miles away. The men climbing into its cockpit over the Solomon Islands had a different priority. They were flying over the slot, that narrow stretch of water between the islands that Japanese supply convoys use like a highway. And their concern was not turning radius. It was range. The P-38 could reach targets that the Grumman F-4F Wildcat and early Vought F-4 U Corsair simply could not reach and still have fuel left to fight their way home. In the vast geography of the Pacific War, range wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between completing a mission and dying over open ocean. The pilots who received the Lightning did what fighter pilots always do with a new aircraft. They tested it hard. They pushed it to the edge of its envelope the way a man jumps on a bridge to see if it will hold. What they discovered confirmed some of the critics' warnings and demolished the rest. Yes, the Lightning could not outturn a Mitsubishi A6M Zero in a slow, grinding, low-altitude circle fight, but it could climb so steeply that a Zero pilot would look up and see only empty sky where the American had been. It could accelerate in a dive to speeds that made the Zero's controls stiffen into near uselessness. And it could cross distances over open ocean that Japanese commanders assumed were safe from American fighter escort, simply because every other American fighter's fuel capacity said they should have been. Then there were the guns. The Centerline weapon package revealed its true character in the first real engagements over Guadalcanal, and the pilots who experienced it struggled to explain it to those who hadn't. Firing all 5 nose-mounted weapons at once was nothing like squeezing the trigger on a wing gun fighter. The closest comparison one pilot offered was this. Wing guns were like throwing a handful of gravel across a room. The Lightning was like swinging a sledgehammer from 2 feet away. Even at Convergence, wing guns spread their fire across a pattern roughly the size of a dining table. The Lightning Centerline package concentrated everything into an area closer to the size of a dinner plate, at any range the pilot chose. 120mm cannon, for .50 caliber machine guns, all striking together. What that concentration of fire did to a Japanese fighter was not damage in any ordinary sense. It was disintegration. Structural failure so sudden and so total that it looked as though the airplane had simply come apart under forces its designers had never imagined it would face. The pilots who began scoring victories with the Lightning in late 1942 and into 1943 weren't following a formally approved doctrine, because none yet existed. What they were developing was something far more authentic, battlefield wisdom. They learned through loss. They observed what got men killed, and then they did the opposite with increasing precision. What the Lightning rewarded was a method that threw out most of the pre-war manuals. It wasn't a duel. It was an ambush conducted at several hundred miles per hour. The method was built on altitude and angles, not turning ability. A Lightning pilot would climb as high as his engines and oxygen system allowed, often above 25,000 feet, where Zero's performance dropped sharply due to its lack of effective high-altitude supercharging. From that height, he would watch the fight below like a hawk studying a field. When the geometry was right, he would push the nose down and let gravity and 4,000 horsepower turn the aircraft into a falling spear. The Lightning would dive at speeds Zero could neither match nor effectively evade. The pilot would fire a burst lasting less than 2 seconds. Then, using the enormous speed built in the dive, he would climb back to altitude before escorting Zeros could organize a counterattack. From commitment to disengagement, the entire engagement lasted less time than it takes to light a cigarette. At the end of it, there was either Zero falling in pieces, or a Lightning pilot climbing away to try again from advantage rather than staying low to brawl, where the Zero would eventually win. The man who did more than anyone to turn the survival technique into something approaching doctrine was a quiet, meticulous pilot from Poplar, Wisconsin, Richard Bong. He had arrived in the Pacific in late 1942 with a disciplinary record that included flying his P-38 in a loop around the base flagpole at Sacramento and then performing a low pass down Market Street in San Francisco. Low enough, reportedly, for housewives to see his face through the canopy. It suggested a pilot with a casual relationship to regulations. But once over the slot, his commanders discovered something else. The same spatial awareness and instinctive understanding of angles that made him reckless at low altitude over California made him lethal at high altitude over the Solomon Islands. Bong read aerial geometry the way a pool player reads a table. He didn't chase. He positioned. He climbed above the fight, waited for the exact moment when the enemy committed to a turn or exposed his flank, and then descended with mathematical precision. His attacks were not emotional. They were calculated. Enter at the correct angle. Fire once. Exit with speed. And repeat. The Zero pilots who had once dictated the terms of engagement began finding themselves hunted instead, not in turning contests, but in vertical space, where convergence did not matter, and where a nose full of cannon and machine guns turned every fire and solution into a potential execution. The gap between a convergence cone and a buzz saw was no longer theoretical. It was falling out of the sky in pieces. Bong was always thinking 3 moves ahead, where his airplane needed to be next, not where the enemy was at that exact second. Richard Bong and the pilots flying beside him began stacking victories at a rate that forced even skeptical commanders to reconsider the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The pattern in the kill reports was too consistent to dismiss as luck. The engagements were short. They began from altitude. They ended at high speed. And the after-action descriptions used words that appear with unusual frequency. Broke apart, came apart in midair, disintegrated. Those were not common phrases in reports filed by pilots flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat or early Vought F-4U Corsair models. The reason was simple. The Lightning Centerline gun package did something wing-mounted guns simply could not replicate. It put enormous energy into one precise location. Instantly, 5 weapons firing from 5 separate points along a wingspan could spread damage. But 5 weapons firing from a single point in the nose could tear the structural heart out of an aircraft before its pilot fully understood he had been hit. Japanese commanders at Rabaul watched the kill tallies closely. For them, air superiority wasn't abstract. It determined whether supply ships reached port or sank into the slot. And what they began to see in early 1943 was troubling. The Americans had found both an aircraft and a method their existing tactics weren't built to counter. In response, Japanese planners began routing their most important flights, those carrying admirals, generals, and irreplaceable senior leadership, through corridors they believed lay safely beyond the reach of American fighters. Geography would protect them, distance would protect them, and the simple mathematics of single-engine range would protect them. They were correct about the single-engine fighters. They were catastrophically wrong about what was coming. On April 14, 1943, an intelligence report landed on the desk of William Halsey, Jr. It had been decoded from a Japanese naval transmission, so detailed that American cryptographers initially suspected it was a trap. The message laid out the complete itinerary of Isoroku Yamamoto's inspection tour bases in the northern Solomon Islands. Departure times, arrival times, exact routing. Yamamoto would leave Rabaul at 0600 on April 18th aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters. He would arrive at Baleo Airstrip at 0745. It was the kind of precision only a man utterly confident in his communication security would transmit by radio. For the Americans, it was something they had wanted since December 7th, 1941, a fixed appointment with the architect of Pearl Harbor. The obstacle was the same one that had defined the Pacific Air War from the beginning: distance. Baleo lay roughly 550 miles from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, where the P-38s were based. In a fighter aircraft, 550 miles wasn't just far. It was lethal. That distance consumed fuel so aggressively there would be almost nothing left for combat maneuvering, nothing for the return trip, no margin for error. Every single-engine fighter in the American inventory in April 1943 could be ruled out with a simple act: draw a circle on a map representing its combat radius. Baleo lay well beyond the edge. That left exactly one aircraft on the flight line capable of even attempting the mission: the twin-boomed Lightning. What followed was mission planning of obsessive precision. In an intercept like this, the margin for error is effectively zero. Arrive 1 minute early, and Yamamoto hasn't appeared yet. Arrive 1 minute late, and he has already landed. Approach from the wrong altitude or direction, and the Zero escorts have time to form a defensive screen. For 4 days, planners at Henderson Field worked through the arithmetic with relentless focus. This was not simply an airstrike. It was a scheduled appointment with history. 16 P-38s were assigned. They were divided into 2 elements with strictly defined roles. For aircraft formed the killer flight, their sole purpose: find and destroy Yamamoto's bomber before it reached Baleo. The remaining 12 will provide top cover, engaging and distracting the Zero escorts long enough for the killer flight to do its work. Every pilot was briefed on one unbreakable rule: top cover would not engage the bombers, under any circumstances. Killer flight would not engage the Zeros, under any circumstances, because in the chaos of combat, the temptation to blur those priorities had doomed more missions than enemy fire ever had. This one could not afford confusion. There would be no second attempt. And the men planning Operation Vengeance were not looking for a fair fight. They were looking for a precise result, delivered at a precise time, at a precise location, 550 miles from home. The Lightnings launched from Henderson Field at 7:25 in the morning on April 18th. Almost immediately, they descended to the lowest altitude the planners dared authorize, no higher than 50 feet above the ocean for the entire outbound leg. Japanese radar installations along the island chain would have detected a formation of 16 fighters at normal cruising altitude, with enough warning time to scramble the Zeros at Baleo before Yamamoto's flight even arrived. But at 50 feet above the wave tops, the radar return from the Lightnings disappeared into ground clutter. The formation became invisible, swallowed by the noise of the sea. Every Japanese installation along the route was effectively blind. The price of that invisibility was brutal. Flying 50 feet above open ocean for over an hour meant fuel consumption rates that left the pilots with a margin of roughly 12 minutes of combat time before the return flight became mathematically impossible. The formation made landfall over Empress Augusta Bay at precisely the scheduled moment, a remarkable testament to the navigation skills of the flight leaders who had flown 550 miles over featureless ocean at 50 feet, using nothing but dead reckoning and a clock. As the Lightnings climbed from the wave tops toward the tree-line of Bougainville's jungle coast, the killer flight leaders saw exactly what intelligence had promised: 2 Betty bombers flying in loose formation at roughly 4,500 feet, with 6 Zeros positioned above and behind them in a protective screen, a formation about to discover was not nearly as protective as its pilots believed. The killer flight pushed to full military power and aimed at the lead Betty from a rear quarter angle. The attack geometry forced the Zero escorts into a terrible choice: dive to intercept the Lightnings before they reached the bombers, or maintain altitude and watch the engagement unfold below. Both options were bad, and that was by design. A Zero diving from altitude against a Lightning already at full military power sacrifices the one true advantage of a diving attack: surprise. And the top cover Lightnings were positioned specifically to punish any Zero that committed to that dive, striking from above while its pilot was focused on the attackers below. The entire setup worked like a trap. Bait and mechanism forged into the same piece of aluminum traveling at 330 miles per hour toward a target whose pilot was only now realizing that the appointment he believed he was keeping was not the one that had actually been made. The lead Lightning closed a firing range in a pass that lasted less than 15 seconds from first trigger squeeze to pull-up. And what the Centerline gun package did in those 15 seconds answered every engineer who had ever called the P-38's nose-mounted weapons an interesting novelty on the wrong airplane. The 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns firing together did not merely damage the Betty. They disassembled it. Concentrated fire tore into the wing roots and engine nacelles with an energy density the Betty's designers had never been required to account for. The left engine failed immediately. The wing began separating from the fuselage. In seconds, the airplane ceased being an airplane and began becoming wreckage before it had traveled another 200 yards. The jungle below Bougainville reached up and took it. No second pass was required. No confirmation necessary. The second Betty broke hard toward the jungle, attempting to use the treeline as cover. The remaining Killer Flight Lightnings pursued to the turn, their centerline guns operating at close range in dense, low-altitude air, where every bullet went exactly where the nose pointed. No convergence calculations. No magic distance to maintain. Just 5 weapons aimed at the same point on a target running out of sky. The second Betty went down in the shallow water off Moyla Point, suffering such catastrophic structural damage that the subsequent search for survivors found very little worth recovering. Above, the Zero escorts tangled with the top cover Lightnings, but they arrived too late at both crash sites to change either outcome by even a single degree. The entire engagement, from the first trigger pull to the moment the last Lightning turned for home, lasted less than 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the P-38 Centerline gun package accomplished what clipboard experts had insisted for 3 years was impossible. It reached across 550 miles of open Pacific, found the one target the Japanese high command believed untouchable by American fighters, and cut it out of the sky with the focused, unforgiving precision of a buzz saw. It did not spray. It did not miss. And it did not care what the engineers back home had written in the margins of their performance charts. The news of Yamamoto's death reached Rabaul before the last P-38 had even landed back at Henderson Field. The effect inside the Japanese high command was not the clean, surgical grief of losing a senior officer in the normal course of war. It was something far more disorienting, the shock of discovering that a place you had believed absolutely safe had never been safe at all. Yamamoto had traveled that corridor precisely because the distances involved made American fighter escort mathematically impossible for every aircraft in the Pacific Theater, except the one that had just returned to Henderson Field with empty gun bays and barely enough fuel remaining to land without switching to reserves. The silence that settled over Japanese naval command in the days after April 18th was the silence of men recalculating assumptions, of officers reviewing maps and realizing that the boundaries of vulnerability were far wider than they had believed, and that the answers were uniformly worse. Back at Henderson Field, the pilots of the Killer Flight and the top cover stepped away from their Lightnings with peculiar emotional flatness, the kind that follows a mission executed exactly according to plan. When precision leaves no chaos behind, adrenaline has nowhere useful to go. Several pilots later described not exhilaration, but something closer to technical satisfaction, like a craftsman lifting a saw and finding the cut exactly where he intended it to be. And the tool that made that cut possible was the same tool the men with performance charts had spent 3 years labeling a liability on an airplane they had already decided was too complicated to survive. Institutional acknowledgement after Operation Vengeance was neither loud nor immediate. Institutions rarely enjoy admitting that the pilots closest to the problem understood it better than the engineers and tacticians furthest from it. But recognition arrived in the form that matters most in wartime: resources and priority. P 38 production climbed steadily through 1943 and 1944 as the aircraft's record in the Pacific made an argument no white paper could. An argument written in confirmed kills, mission completion rates, and the simple, unanswerable fact that the Lightning was doing things in the Pacific that nothing else in the American inventory could do, and doing them with a gun package critics had dismissed as a novelty. The pilots called it a buzzsaw. The Japanese called it something that does not translate cleanly, but carries the meaning of a problem that arrives before you know it is coming and leaves before you can do anything about it. Richard Bong continued flying, continued fighting, continued winning. His consistency transformed him from a talented pilot into a statistical argument that could not be dismissed or rationalized away. His kill count climbed through 1943 and into 1944 with the steady accumulation of a man who had found the right tool for a specific task and learned to use it with precision bordering on mechanical. Each engagement followed the same principles Lightning pilots had refined over the slot in the dark months of 1942: altitude, angles, speed, and the Centerline gun package delivering at close range what no wing-mounted battery could replicate at any range. By the time Bong's Pacific tour ended, his confirmed total stood at 40 aerial victories, the highest of any American fighter pilot in the war, and every one achieved in a single aircraft type the engineering community had once greeted with objections long enough to wallpaper a hangar. The Army Air Forces sent Bong home in late 1944 with a Medal of Honor around his neck and strict orders not to return to combat. It was both a genuine effort to preserve a national hero and a practical understanding that symbols are more valuable alive than dead. Bong accepted reassignment to test pilot duty with the quiet professionalism of a man who understood that the war had already given him more than it owed. He spent the final months of the conflict in Burbank, California, flying the new Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star through its evaluation program with the same focused competence he had brought to every cockpit he had ever entered. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay dropped its weapon over Hiroshima, Bong's P-80 suffered a fuel system failure on takeoff from Lockheed Air Terminal. The aircraft went down at the end of the runway. Richard Bong, who had survived 40 victories against the most capable fighter pilots Japan could field, died in a peacetime test flight before the surrender he had helped earn was formally signed. History sometimes produces that kind of timing without apology or explanation. The P-38 Centerline gun configuration went on to influence fighter design long after the war. Not by becoming universal. Jet-age aerodynamics eventually pushed weapons into wings and fuselages in various configurations, but by permanently establishing principle. Weapon geometry is not a secondary consideration to be resolved after the airframe is drawn. It is a tactical decision. It determines what an airplane can actually accomplish in an environment where geometry is life, a scattered stream of fire is a liability, and concentrated energy delivered to one precise point quickly is the only honest answer. The men who had laughed at the P-38's nose-mounted guns returned to their drafting tables, conference rooms, and filing cabinets. The pilots who trusted those guns with their lives returned to quiet streets in Wisconsin, California, and Georgia. They built ordinary lives around something extraordinary they had proven over the Solomon Islands and the jungles of Bougainville. Most rarely spoke of it with urgency. The men who have used the tool seldom feel the need to argue about whether it works. The argument had already been settled, in a language requiring no translation and admitting no rebuttal, written in empty gun bays, missing airplanes, and a jungle on Bougainville that still keeps the secret of what a buzzsaw does when geometry is right. The man behind the trigger understood the math long before anyone gave him permission to. We tell these stories to ensure that Richard Bong and the pilots of Operation Vengeance do not fade into silence. They took an airplane the experts had already buried and flew it 550 miles over open ocean to prove a timeless truth. The person closest to the problem often understands it better than the person holding the clipboard. And that is a truth worth remembering long after the last P-38 rests in a museum, and the sound of its twin engines has faded from every airfield in the Pacific.